Now, the other story worth discussing are developments in Iran. Many people in that country today are paying their respects following the death of President Ebrahim Raisi. Preparations are actually underway for presidential elections as well. These are live visuals taking place in the city where this is likely to all unfold. Let's make sense of these developments. Bring in Honorary Professor for International Relations at the University of Witwatersrand, Wits University in other words. That's Professor John Stremlau, who joins us via our video link. Great to have you on the SABC, Prof. Thanks very much indeed for making time. Let's just deal with these two major developments separately. We'll kick off with the IEC's application for these arrest warrants. We've already, as expected, heard the US spring strongly against it. Israel has denounced it, but so has Hamas. I mean, do you see this ever materializing in these 5 individuals appearing in court to answer for these charges?
Well, that's a complicated question, and it's a little too early to unpack that. But nevertheless, the timing of this is, I think, opportune because it augments the approach that the South Africans made last week to the World Court, an urgent appeal for the implementation of the partial measures to bring peace and the release of the hostages and the recognition that the Palestinian people are in horrific conditions in Rafah, and it's got to get humanitarian assistance in and a ceasefire and recognition of a Palestinian state. So that's of course the formal approach that Joe Biden has taken. But at the same time, I disagree with Biden's condemnation of the ICC measure because there is a moral equivalence to Hamas leadership and Israeli leadership. Neither of them are in a position to compromise as occurred in the end of apartheid here, which is an analogy to the situation in the Gaza and West Bank that has been for decades known to the world, but Israel continues its approach to ethnic cleansing and getting rid of the Palestinians. And so we're at a critical moment right now, and the Iranian death of the president just complicates the situation even more.
Yeah. Speaking about, the complexity around this, we know the ICC doesn't have its own police, for lack of a better term. Even if these warrants were to be issued, they would rely on law enforcement in the different regions to somehow, I don't know how, frankly, bring these 5 individuals to the court to finally have the trial get underway. It brings us to questions around jurisdiction and whether or not the parties involved here even recognize the standing of the ICC before even contemplating whether they'd adhere to whatever instruction from this court.
Well, no, you've got to back up a second, because we don't even know what the special 3-judge panel at the World Court will decide about the indictments that the prosecutor has presented the court with. Right. That has to be first enacted upon, and then we'll see about the implementation. But you're right, the Israelis are not a party to this dispute, but the fact that it's even raised gives the added moral pressure at a critical moment when somehow we've got to alleviate the human suffering that's going on in Gaza and around Rafah. And so it is like the South African appeal to the World Court. It's adding to the moral pressure as demonstrations are happening around the world. And yes, it's unlikely that you could get a prosecution. On the other hand, it does inhibit Bibi Netanyahu from traveling to Europe, where there are members of the ICC that have signed up, or to South Africa, which he wouldn't come to, of course. But nevertheless, it's a dramatic reminder that neither the U.S. nor Israel are parties to the ICC or Russia or China, the major powers. But nevertheless, it is a step toward enforcing humanitarian and human rights rules of war, and that's an important step. And the characterization of the Israeli leadership and the Hamas leadership, not the Palestinian leadership, but the Hamas leadership, as war criminals, sort of fits. And I'm not suggesting a moral equivalence, because the Palestinians have been abused for 80 years. But nevertheless, it is a striking moment for bringing moral pressure from the international community on Israel to agree to some sort of a ceasefire and a humanitarian assistance and release of the hostages onto Hamas. And yet the leadership does not seem ready to compromise.
Yeah. Well, from where I'm sitting, well, standing, I suppose, it seems very complex indeed. And you've mentioned the idea of moral pressure a number of times. Do you reckon that is ultimately what's going to tip the scale here, in a context where already there've been so many questions around whether these multilateral judicial institutions are able to really do anything to change the material conditions of those who are suffering, both in Israel and Hamas, if you like? And Gaza.
Well, we cannot forget the fact, and you're right to remind us of the fact, that we are in a world of sovereign states. However, the sovereignty is being undermined by the likes of COVID and climate change and other things, other practical concerns, but also, frankly, the Human Rights Declaration, which was made in 1948. Eleanor Roosevelt famously said, "Look, we've got to get something down on paper as a moral pressure," is gradually eroding the sovereign order. Now, I know that that ironically, the authoritarian regimes of Russia and China and Iran are undermining the universal principles that the South African Constitution is founded upon. But nevertheless, the fact that the South African are having a credible election on the 29th is an important sign. The fact that the U.S., even if they can possibly beat Donald Trump in 2024, will maybe put to rest the ethnic nationalism, that is white nationalism, that is rising with Trump. But Israel is a religious nationalist, illiberal democracy that is pushing for the eradication of the Palestinians, as the Chinese are against the Uyghurs or the Russians are in Ukraine. So we're in a confused picture, but nevertheless, I think it's important for South Africa to lend its voice to universal principles of human rights and humanitarian law, and the World Court and the ICC are joining in that battle.
All right. Yeah, I appreciate this is your take. Of course, important to mention that Israel has always maintained that they're acting in self-defense during this time. But you're right, it's an incredibly complex issue, and people see things very differently depending on what they focus on. But what's also taking place in the Middle East, of course, is the funeral service of Ebrahim Raisi, currently unfolding. Thousands of people, I think it's safe to say, gathering there to, I suppose, bid their final respects to the 63-year-old. These are live visuals that are unfolding in the city of Tabrizi. It's near the site where the devastating helicopter crash actually took place on Sunday. What I've been interested to sort of watch, Prof, is the different responses from Iranians themselves. In the wake of the news being made public, there were actually scenes of celebration which stand in stark contrast to, I suppose, the most somber mood that we're witnessing here as the funeral service continues.
Yes, it's true that there are apathetic voters in Iran because they're alienated from this autocratic, theocratic regime. And I I had optimism for reconciliation between Iran and the West when the 2015 nuclear deal was struck by then President Barack Obama. And yet Trump came in and was elected and immediately abrogated that agreement. And the hardliners were in the ascendancy in Iran. And so we're in this mess that we're now in. But I do take some comfort from the fact that I don't think the Iranians have made any effort to say, other than a technical failure, caused this accident of the helicopter downing. And there is no suggestion that the Israelis were behind it, although there is speculation in social media about that, or the Americans or someone else. But the Iranians are, even this hardline regime, are proceeding cautiously. And the U.S. actually sent its condolences for the loss of the president and the others on board that helicopter, that tragic crash. So you know, we're in a moment when maybe there can be a cooling off, and it would be enormously helpful to that process if, to go back to the earlier topic, the Palestinian crisis could be alleviated, because it is just a further division and a source of the risk of escalation of conflict between Israel and Iran.
Right. You know, I think what's also important to emphasize is that what's taking place today comes just a few weeks after Iran unleashed one of the first, if not the first, direct attack against Israel. And part of what's been mentioned in the commentariat is that today the funeral service is not only about, I suppose, showing a level of support and mourning and grief for a country that's lost yet another senior leader of their government, but is also a moment to show some kind of force, right? Some kind of solidarity and unity in a context where Iran itself, of course, has strong adversaries who are watching closely what the country is likely to do next.
That's true. All of that's true. But nevertheless, it is still an autocratic regime. And I just want to say a word of positive support for the role that South Africa is playing, despite the preoccupations that we all have with the election coming up. But nevertheless, the Ramaphosa administration is definitely moving forward to raise the moral pressure for a resolution of the Palestinian crisis, and also I hope is working behind the scenes to bring everybody together around a compromise to not have this escalating tensions escalate out of control. And it does help to have a representative from the global South representing the liberal values that South Africa holds dear in the aftermath of apartheid. And so I salute the Ramaphosa administration for playing as much of a role as it can and under these difficult circumstances when they're preoccupied with an election right at home. So
fair enough.
It's not an easy time.
Certainly not, and it's a complex time insofar as the geopolitics is concerned. Hopefully we're able to kind of work our way through this moment as many others before us have in the past. Professor John Stremlau, great getting your take on these issues as always. We appreciate your time. Professor Stremlau is with Wits University, the International Relations Department there.